All right, let's dive into one of the most surprising connections in the entire Bible. You've got this really strange Old Testament prophet on one hand, and the grand finale of the New Testament on the other. What if I told you they're secretly linked? It's a puzzle that honestly changes how you read both. So let's just get this out of the way. The book of Ezekiel, it's weird. I mean, really weird. One biblical scholar, Dr. Leslie Allen, even calls it an alien book. And you can totally see why. You've got these bizarre visions of wheels within wheels, prophecies delivered through what is essentially street performance art, and just so much detail. It can feel a little overwhelming, right? Kind of distant, super complex, and maybe a bit intimidating. And that, right there, that's the big mystery we're tackling today. If Ezekiel is so out there, how in the world did it become this secret key, this essential guide for the New Testament writers? The answer is pretty cool, actually. It shows us exactly how they read their own scriptures and saw their own story fitting into a much, much bigger picture. Okay, to get our heads around this, let's think of it like a spiritual family tree. The Apostle Paul does this all the time. He talks about the ancient Israelites as our ancestors. He wasn't saying everyone was genetically related, of course. His point was that all believers, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, were part of this huge, sprawling spiritual family. And that family has a shared history you can learn from. But just like with a real family tree, sometimes the connections are hidden. They're not always obvious. And when you start looking for Ezekiel's influence in the New Testament, you're not going to find it in big, flashing neon signs. Nope. It's way more subtle than that. It's like it's woven right into the very fabric of the writing. So let's start with what you don't see. If you go searching for direct, word-for-word quotes from Ezekiel in the entire New Testament, guess how many you'll find? Exactly 2. That's it, just 2. It's like he's almost invisible. But if you start looking for allusions, those subtle little echoes of phrases and ideas, that number just explodes. We're talking at least 139 clear references to Ezekiel. So, what in the world is going on here? And this is where it gets really interesting. Think about it this way. A direct quote is kind of like a footnote in a research paper. It's formal, but an allusion, that's more like a song that's stuck in your head. It just comes out. The New Testament writers weren't just citing Ezekiel like a source. His words, his ideas, his theology, it was so deep in their minds that it just naturally flowed out as they wrote. Okay, so let's break this down. Our first area of connection is what you might call shared prophetic DNA. See, the New Testament writers were all drawing from this deep well of prophetic ideas. And let me tell you, Ezekiel was a huge contributor to that well. For instance, look at this. Way back in Ezekiel 37, God promises a future king, a new David, who will be one shepherd for his people. Fast forward a few hundred years, and who do we hear using that exact same phrase? Jesus, in the Gospel of John, when he calls himself the Good Shepherd. That's not a coincidence. He is deliberately stepping right into the role that Ezekiel laid out. And here's another great example. Ezekiel has this amazing promise that God will take out Israel's heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Well, guess what imagery the Apostle Paul uses in 2 Corinthians? He tells the church that they are like a letter from Christ, but it's not written on stone tablets. No, it's written on tablets of human hearts, and the original Greek there is literally hearts of flesh. It's a perfect echo. All right, but all of that is just the warm-up. Let's move on, because the biggest connection of all, the real mother lode, is hidden in plain sight in the very last book of the New Testament. We're talking about Revelation, and it turns out Ezekiel basically handed John the secret blueprint. I mean, just look at these numbers. Remember those 139 allusions we talked about? A whopping 81 of them, that's over half, are packed into the book of Revelation alone. It's just staggering. The author, John, wasn't just familiar with Ezekiel, he was absolutely soaked in it. He was breathing that stuff. So here's the absolute kicker. The final chapters of Ezekiel, chapters 37 to 48, they aren't just an inspiration for Revelation. They are the blueprint. The whole end-time sequence you read about in Revelation 20 to 22, it follows Ezekiel's playbook. You've got the resurrection of the dead, then the big final battle with Gog and Magog, then the vision of the new holy city, and finally the river of life flowing out from it. John follows Ezekiel's order step by step. Like Dr. Allen puts it, John didn't just cherry-pick a few cool ideas. He took the whole back half of Ezekiel and used it as the foundational script, the model for his entire vision of how things would end. Ezekiel literally gave him the structure, the timetable, and the imagery. Okay, but here's the twist, and it's a big one. John isn't just doing a copy and paste job. Not at all. He takes Ezekiel's vision and actively adapts it. He reinterprets the whole thing through the lens of Jesus. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Let's start with the temple. Ezekiel's vision is obsessed with this huge, grand, meticulously described new temple. It's the centerpiece. But then you get to Revelation, and what does John say? I saw no temple. So what gives? Well, for John, the temple's job is done. Its purpose is fulfilled. Because now you have the direct presence of God and the Lamb, Jesus himself, right there. They are the new center. Okay, what about the priesthood? In Ezekiel's vision, you have this very specific, elite group of priests who get to serve God in the temple. But in Revelation, John takes that idea and just blows it wide open. It gets radically democratized. He declares that God has made all believers into a kingdom of priests. That special access to God, it's for everybody now. And the third big change is the scope of the whole thing. Ezekiel, and this makes perfect sense, is focused on the restoration of his people, the nation of Israel. But when John borrows that beautiful image of the river of life, he adds one crucial detail. He says the leaves of the trees growing by the river are for the healing of the nations, plural. The vision just exploded from being about one nation to being about all of humanity. So all of this brings us to a final, really important point. Both Ezekiel and the New Testament share this deep common tension. They're both pointing to this amazing, glorious future that, well, hasn't fully arrived yet. They're both wrestling with what it means to live in the meantime, in that ongoing wait. Think about it. For the people reading Ezekiel, coming back from exile didn't magically create a Garden of Eden. Life was still a struggle. And for Christians today, the second coming hasn't happened yet. So in a very real way, both communities, separated by hundreds of years, found themselves living in this in-between space. You're living between the promise and its final fulfillment. But the New Testament doesn't see this waiting period as some kind of failure. It's framed as a process. It's like Paul says in Philippians, God has started something good and he will see it through to completion. This waiting, it's a time of growth, of becoming. It's like having a down payment on an inheritance that you know is coming, you just don't have it all in your hands yet. And that's really the final thought to leave you with, this incredible connection between Ezekiel and the New Testament. It shows us a single story unfolding across centuries, a story where promises are made, and then they're echoed, and then they're adapted and made even deeper. It's a powerful reminder that so much of faith is about living in that tension, that space between what's already done and what's still to come. And it forces us to ask a pretty big question. How do we find meaning in ancient promises that are still unfolding, still waiting for their final glorious chapter?